The Galactic Council chambers had never seen such chaos. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire slammed his four-armed appendage against the crystalline podium, sending harmonic vibrations through the vast dome that housed representatives from 47 different species. The sound was meant to call for order, but today it only seemed to amplify the discord. The humans have done it again. Kethvar's translator crackled with barely contained fury. They've completely disregarded the Proxima Accords and established unauthorized colonies in the neutral zone. High Counselor Ythera, a being of pure energy contained within a geometric framework, pulsed with deep purple lights, the equivalent of a heavy sigh among her kind. The Council had been dealing with humanity for barely 3 decades since their discovery of faster-than-light travel, and already they were the most discussed topic in every session. What exactly have they done this time? Ythera's voice resonated directly into the minds of those present, a privilege of her position as the Council's eldest member. The holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy's contested regions. Red markers indicated the locations where human settlements had appeared seemingly overnight. 17 new colonies, announced Data Keeper Vox, a mechanical entity whose species had long ago uploaded their consciousness into synthetic bodies. All established within the last solar cycle, all in direct violation of established territorial boundaries. Ambassador Lyrian of the Celestial Federation, her gossamer wings shimmering with indignation, rose from her curved seat. This is intolerable. We have laws, protocols, agreements that have maintained peace for over 2 millennia. These primates cannot simply ignore our established order. The chamber erupted in agreement. Clicks, chirps, harmonic resonances, and translated voices all merged into a cacophony of complaint. Every species present had their own grievance against humanity's apparent inability to follow galactic law. But not everyone was protesting. In the far corner of the chamber, General Thraknor of the Hegemony military remained silent, his massive frame hunched over a personal data pad. The reptilian warrior's scarred hide told the story of countless battles across multiple star systems, and his silence in the face of such uproar spoke volumes. General Thraknor, Ythera's attention turned to the military commander. Your forces have had the most direct contact with human expansion. What is your assessment? The general's head rose slowly, revealing eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. They are not breaking rules, he said simply, his words cutting through the chamber's noise like a plasma blade through vapor. They are redefining what rules mean. The statement sent a chill through the assembled representatives. Ambassador Kethvar's arm appendages twitched in confusion. Explain yourself, General. Thraknor stood to his full imposing height, nearly 3 meters of battle-hardened muscle and bone. I have studied their expansion patterns, their diplomatic responses, their military tactics. The humans do not see our laws as absolute truths to be followed. They see them as suggestions to be evaluated. Suggestions? Lyrian's voice pitched higher in disbelief. The Proxima Accords were signed by every major power in the galaxy. But not by them, Thraknor pointed out. They arrived after these agreements were made. We presented them with a document and expected compliance simply because it existed. But humans. He paused, accessing files on his datapad. Humans have a saying, rules are made to be broken. Datakeeper Vox's optical sensors whirred as he processed this information. That is illogical. Rules exist to maintain order and prevent conflict. To us, yes, Thraknor agreed. But humans see rules as challenges to overcome, boundaries to push, limitations to transcend. Every law we've presented them has been analyzed not for compliance, but for loopholes. The general activated his own holographic display, showing detailed recordings from recent human settlements. The footage revealed something that made several ambassadors lean forward in their seats. Look at these colonies, Thraknor continued. They are not random settlements. Each one is positioned at strategic points that were technically outside our defined territories due to drafting oversight in the original accords. The humans found gaps in our legal framework that we never noticed in 2,000 years. Council member Zeph of the Aquatic Territories released a stream of bioluminescent particles, his species equivalent of nervous laughter. You're saying they studied our laws specifically to circumvent them? I'm saying they studied our laws to understand them better than we do. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence. The implications were staggering. For millennia, the Galactic Council had operated under the assumption that all sapient species would naturally accept established order once presented with logical frameworks for cooperation. The idea that an entire civilization might view such frameworks as starting points rather than endpoints was revolutionary and terrifying. Ithera's energy form flickered through several color spectrums as she processed this revelation. Show us more. Fraknor's display shifted to show diplomatic communications between humans and various council members over the past few years. Notice the pattern in their responses to our territorial disputes. They never directly refuse our demands. Instead, they ask questions. The recordings began to play. A human diplomat, unremarkable in appearance but somehow commanding attention despite being the smallest being in the room, stood before a tribunal of hegemony officials. You're asking us to withdraw from the Kepler 442 system, the human said, her voice calm and measured. May I ask what specific provision of galactic law grants the hegemony exclusive rights to that system? The hegemony representative had fumbled through legal documents before citing a territorial expansion clause from the original council charter. The human had listened intently, nodded respectfully, and asked another question. This clause mentions established presence as a determining factor. How exactly do you define established presence, and what evidence of such presence exists in the Kepler 442 system? The questioning had continued for hours, with the human diplomat dissecting every legal precedent, every procedural detail, every assumption that the hegemony had taken for granted. By the end of the session, the hegemony had withdrawn their complaint not because they'd been defeated, but because they couldn't adequately defend their own legal position. This is happening across the galaxy, Fraknor explained as the recording ended. Humans are not ignoring our laws, they're exposing the weaknesses in them. And, in doing so, they're creating new precedents. Ambassador Kethvar's appendages had stopped twitching. Now they hung motionless as the full scope of the situation became clear. They're rewriting galactic law from within the system. Precisely. And, here's the truly unsettling part, they're doing it completely legally. The chamber erupted again, but this time the chaos was different. Instead of indignant protests, there was a mixture of fear, admiration, and desperate strategizing. Representatives huddled in species-specific groups, frantically discussing how to respond to a threat they had never anticipated. Datakeeper Vox's mechanical form rotated to face different groups as he calculated probability matrices. The logical response would be to revise our legal frameworks to eliminate the loopholes humans are exploiting. That would take decades, High Counselor Ithera replied, her energy form now cycling through rapid color changes that indicated deep stress. And, by the time we finished, they would have found new gaps to exploit. General Fraknor nodded grimly. Worse than that. Every revision we make teaches them more about how we think, how we structure authority, how we define legitimacy. We would be giving them an education in the very systems they're learning to manipulate. The weight of this realization settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. For the first time in their collective history, the Galactic Council faced a species that didn't just refuse to follow their rules, it was systematically demonstrating that those rules were inadequate. What do they want? Lyrian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What is their ultimate goal? That, Fraknor said, may be the most dangerous question of all. He activated another display, this one showing human population growth, technological advancement, and territorial expansion plotted over time. The curves were unlike anything any council species had ever achieved, exponential growth that showed no signs of slowing. Based on my analysis, they don't want to conquer us or destroy us. They want to make us irrelevant. The silence that followed was deafening. In the Council's long history, they had faced aggressive species that sought conquest, isolationist species that wanted to be left alone, and countless variations in between. But they had never encountered a species that seemed intent on simply outgrowing them. Every time they find a loophole in our laws, they don't just exploit it, they build entire civilizations around it, Fraknor continued. Each new colony becomes a proof of concept, demonstrating that our legal frameworks are insufficient for governing a galaxy that includes human ingenuity. Ambassador Kethvar finally found his voice. Then, what do you recommend, General? How do we respond to a species that follows the letter of our laws while completely undermining their spirit? Thraknor's scarred features arranged themselves into something that might have been a smile on a more pleasant face. We learn. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of minds being forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about order, law, and civilization itself. Learn what, exactly? Ythera asked. We learn that perhaps our way of doing things isn't the only way. For 2 millennia, we've maintained peace through rigid structure, detailed laws, and careful consensus. The humans are showing us that structure can be dynamic, that laws can evolve, that consensus isn't always necessary for progress. Datakeeper Vox processed this statement for several seconds before responding. You are suggesting we abandon the very principles that have maintained galactic stability for over 2,000 years? I'm suggesting that those principles may not be as stable as we thought. The humans aren't breaking them, they're proving they were already broken. General Thraknor gestured to the holographic displays still floating around the chamber. Look at what they've accomplished in 30 years. 17 new colonies, each one more advanced than anything we've built in the last century. They're not just growing, they're innovating at a rate that makes our careful, methodical approach look primitive. And, you admire this? Lyrian's wings had taken on a darker hue, a sign of deep disturbance among her kind. I fear it, Thraknor replied honestly. But, I also recognize that fear is often the precursor to respect. And, respect, Ambassador Lyrian, may be our only path forward. High Counselor Ythera's energy form stabilized into a steady golden glow, a sign of deep contemplation. You believe we cannot stop them. I believe we cannot stop them using the methods that have worked for us in the past. But, perhaps that's not the real question we should be asking. What is the real question? Thraknor's display shifted one final time, showing a projection of galactic development over the next century based on current human expansion rates. The image was both beautiful and terrifying, a galaxy where human influence touched every system, where their dynamic approach to law and society had fundamentally altered the nature of civilization itself. The real question, he said, is whether we want to be part of what they're building, or whether we want to spend the next century desperately trying to maintain a status quo that may already be extinct. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every representative in the chamber understood what the general was suggesting, that perhaps the age of the Galactic Council's absolute authority was ending, and that their choice was to adapt or become irrelevant. But, adaptation would mean acknowledging that their carefully constructed civilization might not be the pinnacle of galactic development they had always assumed it to be. It would mean admitting that a species they had initially dismissed as primitive primates had, in just 3 decades, identified and exploited fundamental flaws in systems that had seemed perfect for millennia. Ambassador Kethvar spoke first, his voice heavy with resignation. If we cannot govern them through existing law, and we cannot adapt our laws fast enough to constrain them, then, what exactly is the function of this council in a galaxy increasingly shaped by human innovation? It was the question none of them wanted to ask, but all of them knew needed to be answered. The Galactic Council had spent 2,000 years believing that order came from above, that peace and prosperity flowed from carefully crafted agreements and methodically enforced regulations. The humans were demonstrating a different model entirely. They were proving that order could emerge from chaos, that innovation could spring from questioning rather than compliance, and that perhaps the most dangerous thing a civilization could do was to assume its current methods were the best possible methods. I recommend, General Thraknor said finally, that we send an official delegation to Earth. Not to deliver ultimatums or negotiate new restrictions, but to understand how they think. Understanding them gives them no obligation to understand us, Datakeeper Vox pointed out. No, Thraknor agreed. But it might teach us how to build something better than what we have. As the session concluded and representatives began filing out of the chamber, each lost in their own thoughts, none of them realized that their conversation had been monitored. Deep in the human settlement on Proxima Centauri, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen finished reviewing the transcript that had been gathered through entirely legal monitoring of public council proceedings. She smiled as she forwarded the document to her colleagues on Earth. The Council was finally beginning to understand what humanity had known from the beginning, that the galaxy's existing order was not divinely ordained or naturally optimal. It was simply one way of doing things, and, like all human-made systems, it could be improved. The real war had never been about territory or resources. It had been about ideas. And ideas, Sarah knew, were the one thing that no law could truly contain. The Earth delegation arrived at the Galactic Council headquarters aboard a ship that immediately violated 17 different design regulations. The vessel was sleek where Council ships were bulky, asymmetrical where they were geometric, and somehow managed to look both ancient and impossibly advanced at the same time. Most disturbing of all, it worked better than anything in the Council fleet. Admiral Elena Vasquez stepped off the transport with the kind of confidence that made seasoned diplomats nervous. She was unremarkable by human standards, medium height, graying hair, laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who found humor in unexpected places. But there was something in her manner that made even General Thraknor, waiting in the reception bay, unconsciously straighten his posture. "Admiral Vasquez," Thraknor rumbled, extending one massive clawed hand. "Welcome to Council Station Harmony." "General," she replied, gripping his hand with surprising firmness. "Thank you for the invitation. Though I have to say, your timing is interesting." Behind her, 6 other humans disembarked. Unlike the carefully uniformed delegations the Council was used to, this group looked like they had been assembled from different worlds entirely. A young man in casual clothing who couldn't have been older than 25. An elderly woman whose eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from seeing civilizations rise and fall. A middle-aged man whose calloused hands suggested he was more comfortable with tools than treaties. "Your delegation is smaller than we expected," Thraknor observed. Admiral Vasquez smiled. "We've found that size isn't always an indicator of effectiveness. Shall we?" The journey through the station's corridors revealed something the general hadn't anticipated. While the official delegation moved toward the diplomatic quarters, the humans were constantly looking around, asking questions, taking discrete measurements with devices that probably violated another dozen regulations. The young man, introduced as Dr. Marcus Webb, stopped at a structural support junction and spent several minutes examining the engineering. The elderly woman, Professor Sarah Kim, engaged a passing maintenance drone in what appeared to be a technical discussion about the station's atmospheric recycling system. The man with the calloused hands, identified only as Engineer Martinez, was methodically photographing structural details. "Is your delegation conducting some kind of survey?" Thraknor asked, trying to keep suspicion out of his voice. "We prefer to understand our environment," Admiral Vasquez replied simply. "Understanding leads to better conversations." When they finally reached the main conference chamber, the assembled council representatives were clearly unprepared for what they saw. Instead of the formal procession of officials they expected, the humans scattered immediately upon entering the room. Dr. Webb approached the holographic display systems, Professor Kim began examining the architectural acoustics, and Engineer Martinez actually crawled under one of the conference tables to look at its construction. "Is this normal human diplomatic behavior?" Ambassador Kethvar whispered to General Thraknor. "I'm beginning to think nothing about humans is normal by our standards," the general replied. Admiral Vasquez, meanwhile, had taken a position at the center of the chamber and was slowly rotating, taking in every detail of the space. When she completed her circle, she looked directly at High Counselor Ythera's energy form. "This is a beautiful chamber," she said. "The acoustic design is particularly impressive. It allows each species to communicate in their natural mode while ensuring universal translation. The holographic systems are elegant, and the seating arrangements demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of interspecies psychology." The compliments were genuine, and the detailed observation showed a level of appreciation that caught the council off guard. This wasn't the behavior they had expected from a species they viewed as chaotic rule-breakers. However, Admiral Vasquez continued, and every representative in the room tensed, "It's designed for a very specific type of conversation." High Counselor Ythera's form flickered through questioning colors. "What type of conversation?" "One where everyone already agrees on the fundamental rules of engagement. The entire space assumes consensus as a starting point. It's optimized for refinement and modification of existing agreements, not for challenging basic assumptions." Dr. Webb looked up from the holographic controls. The display system is fascinating, but it's built to show information that supports predetermined categories. It would be difficult to use it to present entirely new ways of thinking about problems. Professor Kim nodded from her position near the acoustic panels. The translation matrix is incredibly sophisticated, but it's designed to convey meaning within established conceptual frameworks. It might struggle with truly revolutionary ideas that don't have existing precedents in galactic communication. Engineer Martinez emerged from under the table. And the whole structure is built for permanence. Every component is designed to last millennia without change. It's beautiful engineering, but it assumes that the way we do things today is the way we'll want to do things forever. The observations were delivered without malice, even with evident appreciation for the craftsmanship involved. But they were also devastating critiques of the very foundations of council governance. The chamber had been designed to embody the council's approach to civilization, stable, permanent, based on consensus within established norms. Ambassador Lyrian's wings had taken on an agitated shimmer. Are you suggesting our entire approach to governance is flawed? We're suggesting, Admiral Vasquez said carefully, that it's optimized for a specific set of circumstances that may not be universal. She gestured to her team, and they gathered around her with the kind of practiced coordination that spoke of long collaboration. May we show you something? Before anyone could object, Dr. Webb activated a device that interfaced with the chamber's holographic systems in ways that should have been impossible. The device was clearly human technology, but it communicated flawlessly with council systems using protocols that didn't officially exist. The central display shifted to show a three-dimensional model of the galaxy, but not as the council had ever seen it. Instead of the neat territorial divisions and established trade routes they were familiar with, this display showed flows of information, energy, resources, and ideas as dynamic, constantly shifting patterns. This is how we see the galaxy, Admiral Vasquez explained. Not as a collection of fixed territories and static agreements, but as a living system of relationships and possibilities. The model shifted, zooming in on specific regions. Council representatives could see their own territories, but the human display revealed connections and opportunities that their own analysis had never identified. Trade routes that could be more efficient, resource distributions that could support larger populations, communication networks that could span vast distances with remarkable speed. Your legal frameworks are based on scarcity, Professor Kim observed, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture. They assume that resources are limited, that growth requires taking something away from someone else, that stability comes from preventing change. The display shifted again, showing human colonies. But, instead of the aggressive expansions the council had assumed they were seeing, the human settlements appeared as nodes in a vast network of mutual support and shared innovation. We operate from an assumption of abundance, Dr. Webb added. Not because resources are infinite, but because innovation can always create new ways of using what we have. Every problem is an opportunity to develop better solutions. Engineer Martinez stepped forward, pointing to specific details in the display. Your colonies are designed to extract maximum value from local resources and export that value to central locations. Our colonies are designed to add value to local resources and share innovations across the network. The implications were staggering. The Council had been viewing human expansion as territorial conquest, but the humans were revealing it as something entirely different, a kind of civilization-scale research and development project. General Thraknor leaned forward, his battle-scarred features intense with concentration. You're saying your colonies exist to test new approaches to civilization? Among other things, yes, Admiral Vasquez confirmed. Every settlement is an experiment in how to live better, how to work more efficiently, how to solve problems more creatively. When we find something that works, we share it. When we find something that doesn't work, we learn from it and try something else. Datakeeper Vox's optical sensors had been whirring continuously as he processed the human display data. The computational resources required to maintain this level of dynamic analysis across multiple star systems would be enormous. Only if you try to control it from a central location, Dr. Webb replied. But, if you distribute the intelligence throughout the network, if you let each node contribute to the overall understanding, the system becomes more capable as it grows larger. The young scientist activated another device, and, suddenly, the chamber itself seemed to come alive. Information flowed across every surface, showing real-time data from human settlements throughout the galaxy. Production statistics, research breakthroughs, social innovations, artistic achievements all flowing together in a pattern of interconnected growth that was unlike anything the Council had ever conceived. "This is what we mean when we say we don't follow rules," Admiral Vasquez said, her voice taking on a quality that was both gentle and revolutionary. "We don't reject the concept of order. We reject the assumption that order must be imposed from above." The display showed examples of human governance in action. Instead of hierarchical command structures, there were networks of expertise. Instead of fixed laws, there were adaptive protocols. Instead of territorial boundaries, there were collaborative jurisdictions where multiple human settlements worked together on shared challenges. Ambassador Ketvar's forearms had gone completely motionless. "You're describing anarchy." "We're describing emergence," Professor Kim corrected. "Complex order arising from simple rules applied at the local level. It's not chaos, it's a different kind of organization entirely." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans weren't just challenging specific council laws, they were demonstrating that the entire concept of governance could be reimagined from the ground up. High Counselor Ythera's energy forms cycled through colors that had never been seen in the chamber before, combinations that suggested thoughts that had never needed expression. "How do you prevent conflicts between settlements with different approaches?" "The same way nature prevents forests from destroying themselves," Engineer Martinez replied. "Diversity creates resilience. When settlements try different approaches to the same problems, the successful approaches spread naturally. The unsuccessful ones are abandoned, but the lessons learned are preserved." "What about resource disputes? Territorial conflicts? The fundamental sources of interstellar friction?" Ambassador Lyrian demanded. Admiral Vasquez smiled. "What about them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Webb stepped forward, manipulating the display to show detailed resource flows throughout human space. "When your goal is to extract maximum value from fixed resources, conflict is inevitable," he explained. "But, when your goal is to increase the total value that can be created, cooperation becomes more profitable than conflict." The display showed human settlements that were sharing technologies, resources, and expertise in ways that benefited everyone involved. Mining operations that left environments better than they found them. Agricultural techniques that increased productivity while improving soil quality. Manufacturing processes that created valuable byproducts instead of waste. "You're talking about theoretical ideals," General Thraknor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Real civilizations face scarcity, competition, the need to make hard choices between competing interests." "Real civilizations," Professor Kim replied, "create the conditions they choose to operate within. For millennia, you've chosen to operate within conditions of scarcity and competition. We're choosing to create conditions of abundance and collaboration." She gestured to the flowing display around them. "This isn't theory, General. This is data from actual human settlements operating under these principles. It works because we designed it to work." The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that it was more unsettling than any boast or threat could have been. The humans weren't claiming superiority, they were simply demonstrating that alternatives existed to ways of life the Council had never thought to question. Datakeeper Vox processed the human data for several long minutes before speaking. "Your approach appears to be significantly more efficient than established Council methodologies. Productivity per capita in human settlements exceeds Council averages by factors ranging from 3 to 12, depending on the specific metrics examined." "Efficiency is a side effect," Admiral Vasquez said. "The real goal is sustainability. We want to build something that gets better over time instead of wearing down." Engineer Martinez nodded toward the Council chamber around them. "This is beautiful, but it's designed like a monument. It's built to preserve a specific moment in your civilization's development. Our settlements are designed to grow, to change, to become something better than what they started as." The comparison was devastating precisely because it was so obviously true. The Council chamber was magnificent, but it was also static. Every component was designed to maintain existing conditions rather than enable evolution toward better ones. What you're describing, High Counselor Ythera said slowly, would require fundamental changes to the basis of galactic civilization. Yes, Admiral Vasquez agreed simply. It would. The silence that followed was different from any that had ever filled the chamber. It was the silence of minds grappling with the possibility that everything they had built, everything they had assumed was optimal, might be just the beginning of what was possible. Finally, Ambassador Kethvar spoke. What exactly are you proposing? Admiral Vasquez looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each representative in turn. We're not proposing anything, Ambassador. We're demonstrating. Dr. Webb manipulated the display one final time, showing projected development patterns for the next century. Two paths appeared, one showing continued council governance with its careful stability and incremental progress, another showing the exponential growth and innovation that human methods were already achieving. You can continue governing the galaxy the way you always have, Admiral Vasquez said. We're not going to stop you. But, we're also not going to wait for permission to build something better. The projection showed the inevitable result. Within 50 years, human settlements would be so advanced, so productive, and so attractive that the Council's territories would be economic and cultural backwaters by comparison. It wouldn't be conquest, it would be irrelevance. This is what we meant, Professor Kim said gently, when we said we don't break rules, we make them irrelevant. As the human delegation prepared to leave, Admiral Vasquez turned back to address the stunned council one final time. We hope you'll join us, she said. Not as subjects or junior partners, but as collaborators. The galaxy is big enough for many different approaches to civilization. But, it's also too big for any one approach to waste time trying to prevent the others from succeeding. The humans filed out of the chamber with the same casual confidence they had entered with, leaving behind a council that would never be quite the same. Their entire worldview had been challenged not through argument or force, but through demonstration. The rules hadn't been broken. They had simply been shown to be insufficient for the galaxy that was emerging around them. 5 years had passed since the human delegation's visit to Council Station Harmony, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one, not even the humans, had fully anticipated. The changes had started small, almost imperceptible, but they had grown with the inexorable force of an avalanche. General Fracknor stood in what had once been his command center aboard the hegemony flagship Eternal Dominion, but the space no longer resembled a military installation. Where tactical displays had once shown troop positions and weapon ranges, holographic networks now depicted resource flows, innovation clusters, and collaborative projects spanning multiple star systems. The transformation hadn't been imposed from above. It had emerged organically as hegemony worlds began adopting human methodologies and discovering that cooperation was more profitable than domination. The old general was now something unprecedented in hegemony history, a coordinator rather than a commander, facilitating connections rather than enforcing compliance. General, his aide, Commander Zithal, approached with the latest reports. The Kepler 442 system is requesting approval for the new terraforming project. Requesting? Fracknor rumbled with amusement. Since when do our colonies request anything? Since they started collaborating with the human settlement in the neighboring system, Zithal replied, his own tone reflecting the strange new reality they all lived in. The humans have developed atmospheric processors that can complete terraforming in decades rather than centuries. Our colonies want to integrate the technology. Fracknor reviewed the proposal on his personal display. The project was ambitious: 3 worlds working together to create an interconnected ecosystem that would support multiple species while generating surplus resources for trade with other systems. It was exactly the kind of impossible undertaking that humans seem to specialize in making routine. Approved, he said, though he knew the word had lost most of its meaning. The colonies would have proceeded regardless of his decision, and everyone involved understood that his role was to facilitate rather than control. There's something else, Zithal continued, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. We've received a communication from Council Station Harmony. High Counselor Ythera is requesting a meeting. Fracknor's scarred features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. Still calling it a request? Old habits, General. The journey to Council Station Harmony revealed the extent to which everything had changed. Space lanes that had once been carefully regulated and segregated now teemed with vessels from dozens of different species, all following navigation protocols that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the traffic flow itself. Human ship designs had been adopted and adapted by other species, creating a galaxy-wide innovation in transportation efficiency. The Council Station itself had undergone radical modifications. The rigid geometric structure that had embodied Council authority had been supplemented with organic-looking additions that pulsed with activity. The modifications hadn't replaced the original architecture, they had integrated with it, creating something that was both familiar and entirely new. General Fracknor was met at the docking bay by an unexpected reception committee. High Counselor Euthera's energy form flickered with colors he had never seen before, combinations that suggested thoughts that transcended traditional Council philosophy. Beside her stood Admiral Vasquez, looking exactly as confident and unremarkable as she had 5 years earlier. General, Euthera's communication carried warmth that would have been impossible under the old protocols.
"Thank you for coming, High Counselor." Admiral, Fracknor nodded to each in turn.
"Though I have to say, this station looks remarkably different from my last visit."
Admiral Vasquez smiled. "Change has a way of spreading once it gets started."
The corridors they walked through told the story of that spreading change. Where Council Station Harmony had once been a monument to stability and order, it was now a living laboratory of interspecies collaboration. Beings from dozens of worlds worked side by side on projects that would have been impossible under the old system.
In one alcove, Zephyrian engineers collaborated with human programmers to develop new quantum communication networks.
In another, aquatic territory biochemists worked with human doctors to create medical treatments that could work across species barriers. The old barriers between species, territories, and jurisdictions had become guidelines for specialization rather than walls preventing cooperation.
"How many Council worlds have adopted hybrid governance systems?" General Fracknor asked as they walked.
38 of the original 47, Euthera replied.
"The remaining 9 are considering pilot programs."
"And the results?" "Productivity increases averaging 400%.
Resource conflicts down by 92%.
Innovation rates that exceed our best historical periods by orders of magnitude."
They entered the main conference chamber, and General Fracknor stopped in amazement.
The space that had once embodied rigid Council authority had been completely reimagined. The hierarchical seating arrangements had been replaced with flexible configurations that could be adjusted for different types of discussions. The holographic displays now showed real-time data from throughout the galaxy, painting a picture of unprecedented prosperity and growth. But the most striking change was the beings themselves. Representatives who had once sat in isolated species groups were now mixed throughout the chamber, working on collaborative projects that crossed every traditional boundary. The formal protocols that had once governed every interaction had been replaced with the kind of fluid, productive communication that humans seemed to generate wherever they went. "This is what we wanted to show you," Admiral Vasquez said, gesturing to a central display that materialized as they watched.
"The Galactic Collaborative."
The display showed something that would have been incomprehensible under the old Council system: a galaxy-wide network of voluntary associations, shared projects, and mutual aid agreements that operated without central authority or hierarchical control. It looked like chaos, but the data flowing through the visualization revealed patterns of organization that were far more sophisticated than anything the Council had ever achieved.
"How does it work without central governance?"
General Fracknor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer.
"The same way evolution works, Dr.
Webb's voice came from across the chamber. The young scientist had aged 5 years, but his enthusiasm for impossible projects remained unchanged.
"Local adaptation, distributed intelligence, and natural selection for successful approaches."
Professor Kim, now showing more gray in her hair but still radiating the intellectual intensity that had impressed the Council years earlier, gestured to specific details in the display. "Every settlement, every project, every collaboration operates on principles that have proven successful. The ones that work well spread naturally.
The ones that don't work are modified or abandoned."
Engineer Martinez, his calloused hands now directing holographic interfaces with practiced ease, highlighted infrastructure projects that spanned multiple star systems.
We're not governing the galaxy, General. We're providing tools and examples that allow the galaxy to govern itself. The implications were staggering, but they were also undeniable. The display showed resource distribution, conflict resolution, innovation sharing, and cultural exchange happening at scales and speeds that the old council system had never approached. Most remarkably, it was all happening without coercion, without central authority, and without the massive bureaucratic overhead that had characterized council governance. High Counselor Ythera's energy form pulsed with colors that suggested deep satisfaction. What you're seeing, General, is the result of abandoning the assumption that order must be imposed. Instead, Admiral Vasquez added, we've discovered that order can emerge when beings are free to pursue their own interests in ways that benefit everyone involved. Datakeeper Vox, his mechanical form updated with technologies that clearly incorporated human innovations, projected additional statistics. Resource efficiency has increased by an average of 700% across participating systems. Conflicts requiring external intervention have decreased by 98%. Cultural and technological innovation rates are unprecedented in recorded galactic history. General Fracknor studied the data with the analytical mind that had made him an effective military commander. The numbers were almost impossible to believe, but they were backed by real-world evidence from dozens of star systems. What about the species that haven't joined this collaborative network? They're welcome to join whenever they're ready, Admiral Vasquez replied. Or they can continue operating under whatever system works for them. We're not evangelical about our approach, we just make it available. The display shifted to show the 9 council worlds that hadn't yet adopted hybrid systems. They weren't suffering or under pressure, they were simply operating at levels of efficiency and prosperity that were noticeably lower than their neighbors. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to cause crisis, but it was significant enough to inspire curiosity. Most of them send observers to collaborative projects, Professor Kim noted. They're learning our methods at their own pace, adapting what works for their specific circumstances, and ignoring what doesn't fit their needs. No pressure, no deadlines, no requirements for compliance, Dr. Webb added. Just examples of what's possible when beings are free to innovate. General Fracknor was quiet for several long minutes, processing what he was seeing. The old council had spent 2 millennia maintaining order through careful regulation and hierarchical control. The human approach had achieved better results in 5 years through voluntary cooperation and distributed decision-making. What happens when conflicts do arise, he asked. When interests genuinely cannot be reconciled through cooperation? Engineer Martinez activated another display, showing case studies from recent disputes. They're resolved the same way conflicts are resolved in any healthy system, through adaptation and evolution. The examples were instructive. Resource disputes had been resolved by developing new technologies that eliminated scarcity. Territorial conflicts had been addressed by discovering ways for multiple groups to benefit from shared access. Cultural disagreements had been handled by creating space for different approaches to coexist and learn from each other. The key insight, Admiral Vasquez explained, is that most conflicts exist because we assume resources are fixed, territories are exclusive, and different approaches cannot coexist. When you abandon those assumptions, most conflicts dissolve into opportunities for mutual benefit. And when they don't? Then, you have an opportunity to innovate new solutions, Professor Kim replied with the confidence of someone who had seen it work repeatedly. Conflict becomes a signal that your current approach needs improvement, not that someone else needs to be defeated. The conversation continued for hours, with General Fracknor asking increasingly detailed questions about governance mechanisms, resource allocation systems, dispute resolution processes, and long-term sustainability planning. Every answer revealed layers of sophistication that had evolved organically from simple principles applied consistently. Finally, High Counselor Ythera asked the question that had brought them together. General, we're formally dissolving the Galactic Council as a governing authority. The statement hung in the air with the weight of historical significance. An institution that had maintained galactic order for 2 millennia was voluntarily ending its own existence. The Council will continue as a forum for communication and coordination, Ythera continued, but we're abandoning the pretense that any central authority can effectively govern a galaxy this large and diverse. What will replace it? Nothing, Admiral Vasquez said with a smile that was both gentle and revolutionary.
And everything. Dr. Webb gestured to the displays around them. Every settlement, every species, every individual becomes part of the governance system. Instead of a few thousand representatives making decisions for trillions of beings, you have trillions of beings making decisions for themselves in ways that benefit everyone. It scales infinitely, Professor Kim added, because the complexity of the decision-making system grows with the complexity of the problems it needs to solve. Engineer Martinez highlighted infrastructure networks that had emerged organically from local needs. Instead of building massive centralized systems that everyone has to adapt to, you get thousands of specialized systems that connect where it makes sense and operate independently where it doesn't. General Fracknor understood what they were describing, but the implications were almost too vast to comprehend. They weren't just changing how the galaxy was governed, they were redefining the very concept of governance itself. You're describing the end of authority as we understand it. We're describing the evolution of authority into something more effective, Admiral Vasquez corrected. Authority that comes from expertise rather than position. Influence that derives from contribution rather than control. Order that emerges from wisdom rather than force. The displays around them shifted to show projections of galactic development over the next century. The curves were unlike anything in recorded history: exponential growth and prosperity, innovation, cultural richness, and individual freedom that showed no signs of slowing. This is what becomes possible, High Counselor Yathera said, her energy form cycling through colors that suggested wonder and anticipation, when you stop trying to control what people do and start enabling them to do what they do best. As General Fracknor prepared to return to his ship, Admiral Vasquez walked with him through corridors that buzzed with activity from dozens of species working on projects that spanned the galaxy. "You know," she said conversationally, "we never did break your rules." "No," the general agreed, understanding finally dawning in his ancient eyes. "You made them irrelevant." "We showed that they were already irrelevant," she corrected gently. "We just helped everyone else see it too." The journey back to hegemony space took General Fracknor through regions that had once been carefully segregated territories but were now flowing networks of trade, communication, and collaboration. Ships from dozens of species followed navigation protocols that had evolved organically from traffic patterns rather than regulatory mandates. On every world he passed, he could see evidence of the transformation. Architecture that blended the best designs from multiple species. Agriculture that had been optimized through shared research. Industries that had been revolutionized through collaborative innovation. Most remarkably, beings from traditionally hostile species working side by side on projects that benefited everyone involved. When he finally reached his flagship, General Fracknor called his staff together for a briefing that would have been unimaginable under the old system. "The Galactic Council is dissolving," he announced. "As of next month, there will be no central authority governing interstellar affairs." The statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled officers, but Commander Zithal asked the question they were all thinking. "What are your orders, General?" Fracknor's scarred features arranged themselves into the expression that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies across multiple star systems. But now it suggested something entirely different: the satisfaction of a warrior who had finally found a battle worth winning. "We're going to help build something better than anything we've destroyed." The transformation was complete. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy as apparent rulebreakers, demonstrating through their actions that the existing order was insufficient for the challenges and opportunities of an expanding civilization. They had never sought to conquer or control, they had simply shown that alternatives existed to ways of life that other species had never thought to question. The old galaxy, with its careful hierarchies and rigid regulations, hadn't been destroyed. It had evolved into something more adaptive, more innovative, and more capable of enabling the potential that had always existed within every sapient species. Humans hadn't broken the rules that governed galactic civilization. They had demonstrated that those rules were just one possibility among many, and that better possibilities were always available to those willing to question their assumptions and experiment with new approaches. The galaxy had learned that rules weren't divine commandments or natural laws, they were tools created by intelligent beings to solve specific problems. And, like all tools, they could be improved, adapted, or replaced when better solutions became available. In the end, the most revolutionary thing about humanity wasn't their technology or their tactics or their refusal to follow established protocols. It was their absolute conviction that the future could be better than the past, and their willingness to work toward that better future regardless of what existing authorities considered possible. They had taught the galaxy that evolution never stops, that adaptation is always an option, and that the most dangerous assumption any civilization can make is that they have already discovered the best way to live. The war was over, not because anyone had won or lost, but because the very concept of warfare between different approaches to civilization had become obsolete. There was room in the galaxy for every species to pursue their own vision of prosperity and fulfillment, and somehow that diversity made everyone stronger rather than weaker. Humanity had kept their promise. They had created new rules for galactic civilization. Rules based on cooperation rather than competition, innovation rather than preservation, emergence rather than control. And they had done it not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple demonstration that better ways of living were always possible for those bold enough to pursue them.